The millionaire invited the black cleaning lady to his charity gala just to humiliate her. But when she walked in wearing a dress that once belonged to his own mother, the room froze. And by the end of the night, he would be in handcuffs, and she would be sitting at his desk. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the Blackwood mansion, casting golden lines across the marble floor. Victoria was crouched beneath the grand staircase, silently dusting the baseboards with a precision that came not from duty, but from memory. She didn't flinch when the laughter started. Richard Blackwood had entered the room, flanked by two of his old money friends, all holding glasses of something imported and expensive. Their suits were perfect, their arrogance even more so. "Well, well," Richard drawled, pausing just a few feet from her. "Helena and I are hosting a little charity gala this Saturday. Black tie, Beverly Hills finest. I thought it might be educational." He produced a gold-trimmed envelope from his jacket like it was an Oscar. "Here," he said, dropping it onto the freshly polished floor in front of her. "You'll want to dress appropriately, of course. Surely you have something tucked away in your cleaning closet." The men behind him laughed. Helena, leaning in from the hallway, chuckled without even trying to hide it. "She won't come, Richard. People like her know where they belong." Victoria looked up, not fully, just enough to meet his eyes for one quiet second. Then she stood, took the envelope carefully and nodded. No sarcasm, no bitterness, just silence. She turned and walked away, her shoes making no sound on the stone floor. The men stared after her, surprised. Richard shrugged. "She'll never show, but if she does..." His voice trailed into a smirk. Helena whispered something cruel. He laughed louder. That night, in a one-bedroom apartment tucked away behind a shuttered bakery, Victoria sat on the edge of her bed. The envelope lay untouched on the table. The lights were low. She reached under the bed, pulling out an old wooden box. Its corners were worn smooth by time. She didn't open it immediately. Her fingers hovered for a moment, then clicked the latch. Inside was a dress sketch, yellowed photos of a woman in a ballroom, a velvet ribbon, and beneath it all the ring. Blue sapphire, unmistakable, engraved, untouched since the day she placed it there. She held the ring between two fingers, raised it toward the single bulb above her. The stone caught the light like a secret, like something waiting. She placed it on the table beside the envelope, then exhaled slowly, as if setting down the weight of 2 decades. She hadn't looked surprised when he handed her the invitation, because she was. She had been waiting for this, for the right moment, not to walk in as the help, but to return as something they didn't believe she could ever be, something they thought they had erased. What Richard didn't know was that the joke had never been on her. It had always been on him. He just hadn't realized it yet. The Blackwood mansion gleamed under the canopy of night, its towering columns wrapped in gold light, the long driveway packed with luxury cars that sparkled like ornaments on display. Cameras clicked. Champagne flowed. Beverly Hills royalty had gathered, each guest outdressing the next, each laugh louder than the last. Inside, Helena Blackwood adjusted her necklace for the 5th time, sipping something cold and expensive. Outside, a valet turned to see a vehicle, unlike the others, pulling up to the front steps. Not sleek and modern, but vintage, powerful, and polished, like it had been waiting in silence for its moment to return. The door opened, and for a second nothing happened. Then a single black heel touched the ground. Victoria stepped out slowly, her posture upright, her expression unreadable. The dress shimmered in the soft evening light, midnight blue silk, tailored with elegance that whispered of another era. Her hair was pinned with the kind of precision that only memory could craft. She didn't look around. She didn't hesitate. She simply walked forward, one measured step at a time, as if she had been born walking red carpets and marble halls. The valet froze. A camera flash went off. Then another. Whispers started before the doors even opened. "Who is that? Is she with someone important? Why haven't we seen her before?" From the top of the stairs, Richard raised a glass in amusement. "She actually came," he muttered to Helena, who glanced over and paused. Her eyes narrowed. For the first time that evening, something in her gut stirred. "Where did she get that dress?" she whispered. Inside the ballroom, heads turned as Victoria crossed the threshold. The crowd parted without thinking. It wasn't fear, It wasn't even respect. It was confusion wrapped in awe. The woman they expected to ridicule had arrived like a question no one wanted to answer. Patricia Weston leaned into Vivian Chambers. She probably borrowed it, Patricia whispered, trying to smother her own insecurity. Or rented. You can rent gowns like that now. Vivian laughed, but it came out thinner than she intended. Victoria didn't blink. She walked through the room like she had been there before, not as a cleaner, not as a guest, as something else entirely. Her gaze brushed over chandeliers and caviar trays like they were remnants of a life she no longer feared. What no one knew, not Patricia, not Helena, not even Richard, was that the dress she wore didn't come from a boutique or a showroom. It came from a past none of them remembered, a past they had erased, a name they had buried. The last time this dress had graced a ballroom, it was worn by a woman who once stood in the heart of the Blackwood estate. A woman who had played piano in that very hall. A woman whose blood still moved through the room that night, hidden in plain sight. Victoria smiled softly, just once, as a photographer tried to snap her photo and then lowered his camera, unsure why he suddenly felt small. She wasn't the entertainment. She wasn't the joke. She was the storm they had invited without checking the weather. Inside the ballroom, the chandelier sparkled above like a crown of crystal watching over its court. Conversations were swirling, glasses clinking, violins playing in the background. Then Richard Blackwood tapped his spoon against his glass with the practiced arrogance of a man used to commanding a room. The music stopped. The murmur faded. All eyes turned toward the host, who raised his glass with theatrical flair. "Everyone," he called out, his voice thick with smug amusement, "I'd like to introduce our special guest this evening, our very own cleaning lady." Laughter erupted, not polite chuckles, not confusion, but real sharp-edged laughter. It moved through the room like a wave, bouncing off champagne flutes and diamond earrings, stinging sharper than any insult. Phones went up. Faces turned. The crowd didn't just laugh, they captured it. Patricia Weston giggled, her eyes already gleaming with anticipation. "Darling," she said to Victoria, sauntering over with Vivian Chambers trailing behind like perfume, "that dress is simply ambitious. Wherever did you find something like that? A costume shop?" Victoria turned to her slowly, no flinch, no reaction, only silence, the kind that rearranges the air. "Actually," she said, her voice as smooth as piano keys in a forgotten song, "this dress has a very particular history." Patricia smirked, clearly expecting a self-deprecating tale of goodwill bins and borrowed heels. "It belonged to my mother," Victoria continued, her tone calm, deliberate. "The last time it was worn was at a ballroom event, quite like this." Vivian snorted. "Let me guess, at a very exclusive thrift store." Victoria's eyes met hers, not with anger, but something far more dangerous, clarity. "No," she said, and this time the sentence dropped like a blade. "She wore it the night she danced with Henry Blackwood." The laughter stopped. Not all at once, but like dominoes. One by one, mouths stayed open but fell silent. Patricia blinked. Vivian's smile vanished entirely. Helena turned sharply from across the room, her glass frozen in midair. And Richard, who was still mid-toast, faltered. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice louder now but thinner. Victoria looked at him and tilted her head just slightly. "I said this dress belonged to my mother. The woman your father once loved. The woman he promised to protect. The woman whose name you erased." Silence, thick and sudden, crawled over the ballroom like fog. Even the servers stood still. Victoria's gaze swept across the guests. Each one seemed to shrink a little under the weight of her composure. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't shout, but every word hit like stone. "It's strange," she said, "how easily people forget the chapters of a family story that make them uncomfortable." Richard took a step forward, his smile cracking. "You're confused," he said quickly. "I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but this isn't funny." "I agree," Victoria replied, eyes locked on his. "It's not funny, it's history. Your history, ours." For a moment, no one breathed, no one laughed. The cruel smiles that had filled the room only minutes before were gone, replaced by unease, by curiosity, by fear. Victoria hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a scene. And yet somehow, with a few sentences, She had sliced through the atmosphere like a scalpel, peeling back the layers of performance and wealth and pretense, and showing everyone what hid underneath. She didn't come to fight. She came to speak, and every word from her mouth would be another crack in the marble floors they thought could never be broken. The silence inside the ballroom was no longer awkward. It was oppressive, the kind of silence that folds in on itself, stretching seconds into eternity. Somewhere in the distance, the music had stopped, though no one had seen who gave the signal. Helena moved closer to Richard, slipping her hand around his wrist, not out of affection, but instinct. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and she could feel it in her bones before she could explain it with words. Richard's smile was frozen in place, but his jaw had tightened. "You're confused," he repeated, louder now, like volume could erase truth. "This is a private event. I think it's time you." Victoria took one step forward, just one, but it felt like the ground beneath her moved. "My name," she said, and her voice was clear, unwavering, "is Victoria Temps Blackwood." The last name hit the room like a dropped chandelier. Patricia Weston's hand flew to her mouth. Vivian Chambers took a half step back. Someone dropped a fork. In the back of the room, a photographer slowly lowered his camera, uncertain whether to keep filming or just run. "What did you say?" Helena whispered, almost to herself. Her fingers tightened around Richard's wrist. "I said," Victoria repeated, "Temps Blackwood. It's the name I was born with, the name my mother carried, the name your family buried." Richard's face went pale. His lips parted, but no sound came out. And then, slowly, deliberately, Victoria reached into the clutch she carried. From within, she withdrew a small velvet box. She opened it without flourish, without drama. Inside, nestled in deep blue, was a ring, not just any ring, the Blackwood ring, gold engraved with the distinct sapphire crest that had belonged to the family for generations. Helena gasped. "That's impossible," she murmured. "This ring," Victoria said, holding it up, "was given to my mother, Isabella Temps, by Henry Blackwood, your father, my father. He gave it to her when he promised to care for her, when he told her their child me would never be forgotten." Richard took a stumbling step forward, as if he could somehow undo the moment by getting closer to it. "You're lying," he said, but his voice cracked on the last word. "If I were," Victoria replied, "you wouldn't be sweating right now." The guests were no longer spectators. They were witnesses. They looked not at Richard but at each other, at the ring, at Helena's trembling hand. The narrative they had clung to, the man, the mansion, the legacy, was falling apart, one syllable at a time. "My mother," Victoria continued, "was the piano teacher who used to walk these halls long before I scrubbed them. She wasn't a secret, not to your father, only to you." Richard shook his head, panic bleeding through his expression. "No, my father had no other children." "Didn't he?" Victoria's eyes didn't leave his. "Or is that just what you told yourself after you cut off the allowance, sold the house, and left us with nothing?" Helena whispered, "Is this true?" But Richard said nothing. Victoria took one last step forward and looked around the room. "I didn't come here to crash a party. I came here because I was invited, not by you, but by fate, by timing, by the truth that refuses to stay buried." The ring in her hand caught the chandelier light just right, casting a blue reflection on Richard's stunned face. "Tonight," she said, "was meant to humiliate me. Instead, it reminded everyone here that blood has memory, and mine remembers everything." She closed the ring box slowly, and for the first time in 20 years, the name Blackwood didn't feel like a shadow. It felt like justice waiting to begin. The silence that followed Victoria's last words was electric. It didn't fade, it thickened. The kind of silence that comes not from the absence of sound, but from the weight of truth settling into the cracks of a carefully polished lie. Richard stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, his face blank, his mouth slightly open, as if his mind was still trying to rewrite what had just been said. Helena had stepped away from him now, her hand dropping from his arm. She wasn't holding him back anymore, she was distancing herself, and then the front doors opened. 3 figures entered the ballroom, dressed not for a party, but for a reckoning. The first was a woman with sharp eyes and a recorder already in her hand, Diane Morrison, one of Beverly Hills' most respected investigative journalists. The second was a tall man in a dark suit, carrying a leather briefcase, David Chun, an attorney known for inheritance law and taking down the wealthy who believed they were untouchable. And the third was an older man with shaking hands and sad eyes, Dr. Hamilton, the family's longtime private physician. A wave of whispers spread across the room. Faces turned. Phones were raised, then lowered again. This didn't feel like gossip anymore. It felt like history in the making. Victoria didn't smile. She didn't move. She just nodded once, and Diane Morrison stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," Diane said calmly, her voice carrying over the crowd, "this is not a performance. This is a documented legal intervention. We ask that you refrain from recording. What happens next will be entered into public record." Richard tried to speak, but nothing came out. His throat had gone dry. Dr. Hamilton stepped up beside Diane, wringing his hands. He looked at Victoria for a moment, and she gave a silent nod. 20 years ago, he began, his voice low but steady, Henry Blackwood did not die of natural causes. He was poisoned, slowly, over months, by arsenic. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Patricia Weston stumbled back against a table. Someone dropped a glass. Richard's face turned white. "That's a lie," he shouted. "My father died of heart complications. Everyone knows that." Dr. Hamilton didn't flinch. He suspected his company funds were being embezzled. He changed his will. He planned to report it. And within weeks, he began to show strange symptoms. "I was coerced into signing a falsified death certificate. I was threatened with the loss of my medical license and worse." "By whom?" someone asked from the crowd. Dr. Hamilton looked directly at Richard. "By him." All eyes shifted. Richard's hands were shaking now. "You have no proof," he growled. Victoria reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and with a single tap, connected to the mansion's sound system. A voice filled the ballroom, Richard's voice. Clear, angry. "Shut your mouth, Hamilton. If anyone hears what you found in his blood, you'll never work again. That woman and her bastard daughter, they'll fend for themselves." No one breathed. Victoria spoke, her voice soft but unshakable. "This recording was made the week after my father died, and it's just the beginning." David Chun stepped forward, opening his briefcase. "Here is a notarized copy of Henry Blackwood's original will. It names Victoria Temps Blackwood as a legal heir. This document was never executed due to falsified medical records and withheld information." "You're bluffing," Richard hissed. David didn't even look up. "We also have the bank statements that show a large transfer from your personal account to Dr. Hamilton 3 days after Henry's death." The memo line reads, "Silence is golden." The crowd gasped again. Helena backed away from Richard, visibly shaken. Victoria turned slowly, letting her eyes pass over every face in the room. "For 2 years," she said, "I cleaned the blood of my own father off the hands of his killer, quietly, carefully, until I had everything I needed." Richard lunged forward, desperate. "Even if it's all true, the estate's already been settled." "You get nothing." David Chun raised his hand. "Not exactly. In cases of criminal activity, especially murder, assets can be frozen, re-evaluated, and redistributed according to the original legal will, which we have." The walls of the Blackwood legacy began to crumble, not with explosions, but with quiet, undeniable truth. Victoria didn't shout. She didn't demand. She just revealed. And with every revelation, the man who once towered over her shrank a little more. Diane Morrison stepped forward one last time. "For the record, Mr. Blackwood, we also have transcripts of 5 calls made between you and Dr. Hamilton, each one a threat, each one preserved. Justice may take time, but it never forgets." Victoria walked to the center of the room. She didn't look angry, she looked free. "Tonight was supposed to be a lesson in humiliation," she said. "Instead, it will be remembered as the night the past came back to finish what it started. I didn't come here seeking revenge. I came for the truth. And now," she paused, her eyes fixed on Richard, "the truth has spoken." And for the first time since Henry Blackwood's death, it echoed through the mansion louder than any lie ever had. The ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It had become a courtroom without walls, a confession chamber dressed in chandeliers. The projector lit up the back wall of the hall, casting shadows over trembling shoulders and silent mouths. Diane Morrison stood near the controls, her expression clinical. On screen appeared a bank document. It was a wire transfer, $200,000 from Richard Blackwood's private account to Dr. Hamilton, dated 3 days after Henry Blackwood's death. The memo line read, "Silence is golden." The room gasped as one. Helena covered her mouth. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she stepped away from her husband like she was distancing herself from something contagious. Richard reached for her arm. She pulled away. Then another slide, a recording. Richard's voice again, speaking to someone presumed to be his accountant. "Make the numbers dance. If anyone finds out I've taken out 20 million over the last 5 years, I'm ruined. Blame it on market losses, expansion, anything. Just make it disappear." Someone dropped a glass. Someone else whispered, "My God." Patricia Weston stared at the floor. No one was smiling anymore. Victoria stood still in the center of it all. She didn't gloat. She didn't weep. She simply watched, calm as the eye of a storm. And in that calm, everyone else began to crumble. Helena's phone buzzed. She answered it with trembling hands. The voice on the other end was young, shaken. "Mom, what's going on? Are the stories true? Is Dad really? Is he?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. She just looked at Richard across the room. A man once so full of swagger now looked like he was drowning. Richard stumbled forward, not angry, not defiant, just broken. He looked at Victoria, eyes glossy, lips trembling. "Please, you've made your point. The guests, the media, the staff, they all know. You got what you wanted. Stop this." Victoria's voice was soft. "What I wanted? No, Richard. What I wanted died 20 years ago with our father. This is what the truth looks like when it finally has a voice." Diane kept going. On the screen now were emails, messages exchanged between Richard and local officials. Promises of favors, veiled threats, money funneled through charities to private accounts. David Chun stood beside her, reading aloud from court-ready affidavits. Every word stripped away another layer of the myth Richard had built around himself. One guest whispered to another, he wasn't just greedy, he was dangerous. By the third video, Richard had stopped protesting. His hands were on his knees, his tie was loose, his forehead glistened with sweat. Helena was now seated on the far side of the room, her body turned away, her eyes vacant. Victoria stepped closer. She wasn't angry, she wasn't triumphant. She looked at him with something more difficult. Clarity. "You didn't just steal from a company," she said. "You stole a life. You stole a father from his daughter, a family from a child, and 20 years of dignity from someone who never asked you for anything." He dropped to his knees. "I didn't know. I didn't think. I was trying to hold it all together. For the business, for the family." Her reply was colder than rage. The business thrived on silence. The family thrived on lies. All I did was turn on the lights. From outside, faint but growing louder, came the sound of sirens. Diane turned to the guests. "The police are en route. They've been briefed. Arrest warrants have been issued for murder, fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy. We advise everyone to remain on site as statements may be required." Richard looked up at Victoria one last time. "You destroyed my life," he whispered. Victoria tilted her head. "No, Richard, I revealed it. And now, for the first time in 2 decades, the truth finally belonged to the ones who had suffered in silence. Not as revenge, not as spectacle, but as something far more powerful, justice." 6 months later, the building that once bore Richard Blackwood's name had changed in more than just signage. The marble floors remained, but now they reflected something new. Laughter echoed in the hallways. Light poured through windows that had once been shaded. And behind the glass doors of the top-floor office, Victoria Temps Blackwood sat at the same desk Richard once used to orchestrate his empire of silence. The walls were no longer lined with self-congratulatory awards. Instead, they displayed certificates of scholarship recipients, framed photos of employees who had risen from entry-level to leadership roles, and a quote etched in gold above the door. "Power means nothing if it forgets where it came from." The company had transformed. Healthcare was now provided for all employees and their families. A scholarship fund had been created in Henry Blackwood's name, not to honor a perfect man, but to acknowledge a flawed one who left behind unfinished promises. Promotions were now merit-based. Quarterly bonuses were public, transparent. The janitor knew the CFO's name, and the interns no longer fetched coffee, they contributed to meetings. Victoria walked the halls often, not to inspect but to listen, to remember, and each time she passed the cleaning staff, she made sure to greet them by name. One afternoon, Helena arrived. She looked different, simpler, no jewelry, no driver. Just a mother with heavy eyes and steady hands. The receptionist called up, and Victoria told them to send her in. They sat across from each other without the weight of judgment. "I came to say thank you," Helena began quietly. "Not for exposing Richard, not for what you built, but for sparing my children." Victoria nodded. They were never part of the crime, only the silence. Helena's eyes welled. "You could have taken everything, you didn't." "I didn't need to," Victoria replied. "Justice doesn't mean leaving others broken. It means building something better than what broke you." Helena reached into her purse and pulled out a single photograph. It was of Henry Blackwood, smiling, young, at a piano. Victoria took it, and for a moment neither woman said anything. "I hope they learn from you," Helena whispered, "because I have." Victoria didn't answer. She didn't need to. Some victories roar, others are quiet, steady and slow, like roots reclaiming earth that once refused them. Victoria had been handed a story of pain. She chose to rewrite it as power. And in the ashes of a house built on cruelty, she laid the first brick of something that would last. The letter arrived without ceremony, no return address, just a plain envelope with her name written in a familiar hand. Inside, the handwriting was shaky, uneven. Richard Blackwood, once master of empire and ego, now spoke from a prison cell. He wrote of regret, of sleepless nights, of a monster he hadn't realized he'd become until it was far too late. He asked nothing directly, only said that his children had started asking about her. They wanted to meet the aunt who didn't destroy the family, who held it together when everything else fell apart. Victoria folded the letter quietly and placed it in a drawer. She didn't respond. Later that week, she sat across from a Forbes journalist in the garden outside the new company headquarters. Employees chatted under umbrellas. Someone laughed near the coffee cart. Life, real and unfiltered, moved gently behind her. The journalist leaned forward. "Some say what you did was revenge dressed as justice. What do you say to that?" Victoria didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted to a young woman in a blue uniform helping a senior employee carry lunch trays. She smiled at the sight, then looked back at the interviewer. "Revenge," she said calmly, "would have been tearing everything down, leaving nothing. Letting the pain consume the world the way it consumed me." She paused. "Justice," she continued, "is truth with direction. It's not about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about making sure no one else is ever hurt the same way again." The journalist scribbled something quickly, then stopped. "And forgiveness?" he asked. Victoria tilted her head slightly. "Forgiveness is a door I don't lock. But I decide who gets to walk through it." That evening, she returned home to the quiet apartment she now shared with two adopted daughters. As she helped them with homework, one of them asked about the picture frame on the shelf, the one with the man playing piano and the woman in the blue dress. Victoria smiled. "That's where I came from," she said, "but not who I became." And as the sun dipped low behind the hills, the last chapter of a long, bitter story closed. Not in fury, not in triumph, but in peace. The kind only truth could write. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.